Can't have y'all sleeping on me. Got to pay attention this morning. So we're glad to have you here at East Heights on Father's Day. Me and my dad, we have a pretty close relationship. I hope you do as well with your dad. Every Sunday before he goes to Sunday school, he'll stop over in the children's building to see me. Because as Brother Gary said, I'm the children's pastor. Although I know he's stopping over there to see his grandson, I like to think it's because he's seeing me. And so this morning was no different. He stopped over there. And he told me Happy Father's Day. I told him Happy Father's Day. And he said, son, what does it feel like to have the greatest dad in the world? So I hugged him, and I said, Dad, I don't know. Leighton's not old enough to tell me that yet. So I hope you all have a great Father's Day on behalf of East Heights to you. So we're going to be looking at the parable of the lost son this morning, just in case you didn't read your bulletin. It's on the back with the notes, and you can find it in Luke chapter 15. That's where we're going to be this morning. How many of you have ever heard the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son? I imagine a lot of you have. But I want us to examine it a little bit different this morning. I want us to look at it in a way that maybe you haven't looked at it before. And in case you haven't heard this parable before, it's about two sons, two brothers, and one of the sons takes his inheritance early, while the other one stays with his father. And the one who took his inheritance early, he blew all of it. He wasted it. He threw it away practically. So I want you, as we talk about this parable, I want you to examine your life. I want you to examine yourself on where you are in this parable. Where you are with the son, the youngest son, the youngest one. So we're going to begin reading in Luke chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 11. It says this. He also said, and this is Jesus speaking, a man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So he distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country, where he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the carob pods the pigs were eating, but no one would give him any. All right, so up to this point, we see that the younger brother, the younger son, asked his father for his share of the inheritance. Now, in this time, the younger son would get 1/3 of the inheritance. So he goes to his father and he asks for his inheritance early. Now, if you don't know what inheritance is, it's what you get when your parents pass away. In this case, the father. So think about it like this, dads, even moms, think about this. Your son or daughter comes to you out of nowhere and says, Dad, you know I love you, right? Yeah, son, I know that. Well, even though I love you, I wish you were dead because I really wish I had everything that you have now. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, right? How would that make you feel as a parent? One, if I was that dad, I'd probably take my belt off and whip him. But that's not what the dad did. What did the dad do? He distributed the assets. He gave it to him and said, here you go. Now, some people may say this dad was foolish. That's what this whole thing about is the foolish dad. No, I think the dad had a plan that we can't really see in the first verses here. So the son asked for what he would get when the father died, and the father gave it to him. And then we see, when we keep reading, that the son lived foolishly. So that comes to our first point. Have you lived foolishly? Now, if we're looking at this, you may not have ever told your parents, I hate you, I wish you were dead. Although, if we're honest, in our teens, we get pretty angry and we say some pretty crazy stuff. So maybe you have, but you didn't mean it like this. But we have lived foolishly. Okay, he wasted everything he had. Okay, he went and he partied in this country far away from where he was. He probably gained a lot of friends who only liked him for what he had. Okay, because as we see, once he had nothing, he no longer had friends or parties or these great things he thought he had. See, he ignored the way he was raised. I don't know about y'all, but my parents didn't raise me to go party, right? That's a decision you make somewhere along your life. That you're going to say, hey, I'm gonna go do this. So he ignored the way he was raised. He lived a self-centered, selfish lifestyle until it happened. Until he lost everything. He hit rock bottom. Okay, now maybe you've hit rock bottom. Maybe you're still at rock bottom. See, he was at such a low point in his life that he was going to eat pig slop. I mean, hey, I'm sure if I'm hungry enough, I'll eat pig slop, but that's not going to be the first thing on my menu. I'm not going to go up to my dad after church and say, hey, let's go eat some pig slop for lunch. All right? That doesn't sound very appetizing to me, but that's where he was in his life. Okay, he was living so foolishly that he had nothing left. Now, you may be at your low point in your life. You may be coming out of your low point. But I can tell you that you have lived foolishly. Okay, it's not a question. Maybe I should have reworded the first point to, you lived foolishly. Because let me tell you why. One of my favorite verses is Romans 3:23. Does anybody know what Romans 3:23 says? Sure you do, but I'm going to tell you anyways. It says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Therefore, we've all lived foolishly. Because what is sin? Sin's not glorifying. Sin's not acceptable to God. Sin is selfless. Sin is nothing but foolish behavior. So therefore, I know we have all lived foolishly. Some of you may still be living foolishly. Some of you may say, you know what, this sin is so much fun. I'm staying in it. I'm staying in it. I'm turning my back on God. That's foolish behavior. And some of you say, yeah, murderers, they're bad. You know, thieves are bad. Rapists, they're bad. Those are terrible sins. But what about liars? How many of you ever told a lie? Some of you lying right now. Proverbs 12:22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. What about lust? How many of you have ever looked at someone else that wasn't your husband or your wife and said, oh, they're kind of cute? Maybe you didn't say it out loud. Maybe you thought it. Jesus said, if you even look at someone with lustful intent, you have already committed adultery in your heart. So maybe you're not acting on all these sins that you're thinking, but you're still living foolishly. Yeah, murders are bad, but little white lies are just as bad. They're equally as harmful, and they all sins require shedding of blood to be forgiven. But luckily we have a God who loves us enough that he sent his son, Jesus, to pay that price. Dads, how many of you would do that? How many of you would say, I don't really know that person, but come on, son, it's time to forgive them of their sins. Pull out a pocket knife. No, we wouldn't do that, but God loves us enough to where he did. So we've all lived foolishly at some point in our life. See, we're all lost at some point. And I'll go ahead and tell you, there are people here today who are lost in sin. There are people sitting right beside you who are lost in their sin. People who may even think they are saved, but they aren't. Church, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. Just because you've gone to church your whole life doesn't mean you're saved. Just because you know the Bible cover to cover, it doesn't mean that you're saved. Ask yourself this question. Have you acknowledged your faults? Have you acknowledged your faults? See, in this parable where where the young son becomes a lot smarter than a lot of us, is he acknowledged his faults. Let's look starting in verse 17. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food? And here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up, go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands." So he got up and was still a long way off, and his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." So here we see that the son made the most important decision of his life. He woke up to the realization that the choices that he made, the choices that brought him into the lowest point of his life, to a disappointing, desperate place in his life, he woke up to that. And he made the decision to not allow those choices that he had made control his future. Okay, he wasn't going to allow himself to stay down. He saw a way out of the foolish, sinful life he was living. Too many times, church, we see that we don't feel good enough to accept God's grace. We say, "I've done too many bad things. There's no way that Christ's blood is for me." Maybe you've said that. Maybe you've heard someone else say that. And too many times we make our past affect our future. Too many times we say, "I've done way too many wrong things. I'm not going to church. It's not for me." Maybe you're there now. Maybe you're making those wrong choices today. And you're going to leave here today and you're going to let those wrong choices you're making affect the rest of your life. You're not promised tomorrow. You may walk out of here today and drop dead. And because you allowed those choices to affect you, you're going to die and go to hell. But you see, this lost son, he acknowledged his faults. He looked back to where he messed up. He looked back and he said, "This is the point where I went wrong." And that was when he left the Father. That was when he left. When he turned his back on his Father because he thought he knew best. Now let's replace that with God. He turned his back on God because he thought he knew best. Because he wanted to do his way. He wanted to do it his way. And we know the Bible tells us our ways are not God's ways. So have you acknowledged your faults? Can you look back and say, at this point in my life is when I decided I was going to change where I was going. At this point in my life, I realized that I was living a sinful, foolish life. And I know now that I need to go back to the Father. Church, if you can't think back to that point, and I want you to try to, think back to that point. If you can't remember at that point in your life you was going to change your future, you may still be headed in the wrong direction. See, I can remember that point when it was for me. It was during a revival, and it totally changed my life. During revival, I was sitting about right here. I was sitting here during a revival at this church. It was a Tuesday night, and the preacher was preaching fire and brimstone. As the invitation was getting closer, I was already like this, gripping the pew. And before he even finished the prayer, I was up and I was walking because I knew that I was going to hell if I didn't make that choice and change my future. Can you remember that night for you? Can you remember when that was for you? Because if you don't know when that was, if you just say, "No, I've always been saved," no, you weren't. Too many people have this thought built up in their mind that I've gone to church since I was a baby. God's going to let me into heaven? You're wrong. If you've never made that decision to accept Jesus into your life, just because you've gone to church and been a good person and know the Bible, it doesn't mean you're going into heaven. Jesus said he is the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except through him. So how many ways is there into heaven? Is there multiple? No, there's only one. There's only one way. And for me, I can look back and say it was at this point in my life is when my name was written in the Lamb's Book of Life. It was at that point in my life when I said, you know what, my future is not going to be directed by my past. Because there's too many people who believe that they can just come to church and everything's going to be okay. See, I can look back and I can know that that was the moment in my life that I was changed. You see, that night when I came down, I acknowledged my sins. I acknowledged that what I was doing was wrong. The mistakes that I made, I knew that night I was going to stop making those mistakes. See, I went back to the Father that night. I said, I'm at rock bottom. I have nothing, because although what I was doing seemed fun, what I was doing was going to lead me to hell. And so I made that realization, and I went back to the Father. Now, from that point on, was I a saint? I can tell you I was no saint. From that moment on, I still made mistakes. We all do, because we're human. But that moment where I accepted Christ into my life, I knew that I was going to be forgiven. I knew that I could ask God to forgive me and help me stay on the right path. Those mistakes I made did not define who I would become. Are you going to allow your mistakes to define who you're going to become? Are you going to be constrained by your failures? Have you been forgiven? See, the son made this decision to go back home and admit that he was wrong. Church, there's people here today who need to go and admit that they were wrong. Maybe it's to your husband. Maybe it's to your wife. Maybe it's to your kids. Maybe it's to God. Maybe you have been living a lifestyle that's not acceptable in God's eyes. And maybe you need to go home to God and say, I was wrong. I'm acknowledging my sins today. Church, I'm going to ask Brother Gary to come up, because we're going to stop right here and have a moment of invitation. Because if you've never made that decision in your life to move forward from your failures, to move forward from your mistakes, let that be today. God, let that be today. Make the decision to acknowledge your faults. Acknowledge your mistakes. And come to the altar. Maybe you just need to pray one-on-one with God. Maybe you need to come and talk to me. Or maybe, like I said, maybe you need to go to someone who's here today and make things better with them. See, too many times we allow our shame of our sins to hinder what we need to do. You see, it took the lost son, it took him nothing, empty-handed with the pigs to overcome his shame. Church, I'm here to tell you today, you don't have to hit rock bottom before you make that decision. You can make it today. Make it before you get there. And don't allow your past to control your future.
Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Let's stand. Come broken-hearted, let rescue begin. Come find your mercy, O sinner, come near. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't hear. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't hear. Lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. Oh, wanderer, come home. Come sit at the table, come taste the grace. There's rest for the weary, a rest that endures. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can cure. Lay down your burdens, and lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart. As you.
Y'all can be seated. All right, now let's keep going in this passage, in this parable here, and let's look what happens. In verse 22, it says, "But the father told his slaves, 'Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fatted calf and slaughter it. And let's celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." I'm going to skip verse 25 because it's about the other brother who comes in and is talking to the dad and says, "Are you kidding me right now? He left you and abandoned you, and I stayed here." And then the father says, "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. You see, they celebrated because what was once lost became found. Church, that day I accepted Christ into my life as my Savior. There was a celebration in heaven on my behalf. Because see, I was lost, and I became found and forgiven. See, angels in heaven glorified God because another one of his children came home. See, that last verse says it all. It said we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is now alive again. He was lost and is found. Church, maybe you're here today and maybe you're lost. Or maybe you are dead in sin, or maybe your spiritual life just isn't where you hope it would be at this point in your life. We already had our invitation, but that doesn't mean you can't come down. That doesn't mean that you just leave unchanged. Don't leave today without being forgiven. See, some of you here are lost, and some of you haven't acknowledged your faults and your sins. Don't leave without making it right. Because if you leave knowing that you don't know what point in your life you accepted Christ, that could be the worst mistake of your life. Because like I said, you're not promised tomorrow. Let there be a celebration thrown in your name because you turned away from your foolish living. See, if you've never given your life to Christ, if you can't remember when that was, let it be today. Come down today. Let us all rejoice in your new life. Let us celebrate with you. See, Jesus gave his life for you and for me. See, his blood was poured out for us. We sinned. We messed up. And we turned our backs on God. We turned our backs on God. We ran away to indulge in sin, to have a foolish lifestyle. But there has to be a point in our life where we realize that we are wrong. And we need to go back to God. So the last point was this. Have you been forgiven? Have you been forgiven? Because it's simple. It's not a hard process. That's something between you and God. So we're going to move on with the next thing in our service, but don't leave today without knowing that if you die tomorrow, that you'll be spending eternity in heaven. If you can't say that's going to be you, please don't leave today. I'll hang out for a little while down here near the end of the service once it's over. Come talk to me. Because I promise you, I will take time out of my day to share that with you. Don't leave today without knowing that you have been forgiven.